You will hear the term production function thrown around in economics circles, and it might seem a little intimidating and a little mathy at first, but as you're about to see, it's a fairly basic idea. It's this idea that you could have these various inputs. Let's call this input number 1, and then you have input number 2, and you can keep going. And then you put them in, their inputs, into some type of process, and then that function, let's just call that f, that's going to describe how much output you can get given that input. We can also describe it a little bit more mathematically. Those of you who remember your Algebra 2 might recognize this, where we could say the output, it's often used the letter Q in economic circle, it's going to be a function, it's going to be a function of the various inputs. So I'll put input number 1, input number 2, and you could have as many inputs as is necessary to produce that good. And these inputs, if you wanted to categorize them, these are the classic factors of production that we would have talked about before. These would be your land, labor, capital, and entrepreneurship. And it doesn't have to be all of them, but each of these inputs would likely be factored as one of these. Now, this might still seem very abstract and very mathy. So to make things very tangible, let's give a tangible example. Let's say that we're trying to make a bread toasting operation. So what we need to do is we take bread, we stick it in a toaster, and then once it's toast, we're done. And so what are our inputs there? Well, you're definitely going to need some bread. So let me draw some bread right over here, my best attempt at drawing bread. So that right over there, that is bread. You could call that input number 1. Now you're also going to need a toaster, at least one toaster, or toasters I should say. And let's say the toasters that we use for this operation, they can toast 4 pieces of bread at a time. And it takes 10 minutes to do that. 4 slices in 10 minutes. Now you might say, well, aren't those going to be all of our inputs? But then the obvious question is that bread isn't just going to jump into the toaster on its own and then jump back out. Needs to be some labor to operate this operation. So we're going to need some toaster operators. And let's say that they can process 1 slice per minute. 1 slice per minute. I know many of y'all are thinking that you could do better than that, but try to do it all day. 1 slice per minute. Now, based on this, if these are really all of the 3 inputs into producing the output, toasted piece of bread, we could try to construct a production function here. So let's do that. So let's say the output is going to be the number of slices of toasted bread. And it's going to be equal to, and I'm going to write this as, well, I'm going to make our production function as being the minimum of several values. And what you're going to see is going to be based on what's going to be our rate limiting factor. And I don't want to get too much in the weeds with you on this, but just to help us understand. So it's going to be the minimum of, well, the amount of bread you have. So slices of bread. And why does that make sense? Well, the amount of toasted bread you can produce is always going to be limited by the amount of untoasted bread that you put into your process. If you only have 60 that's going in per hour here, well, then you can only produce a maximum of 60 right over here. And this is going to be per hour. So this is going to be the slices of bread per hour. Now our other input, how much toast can one toaster toast in 1 hour? Well, if they do 4 slices in 10 minutes, we'll multiply that times 6 to get to an hour. That's going to be 24 slices per hour. So we could do 24 times the number of toasters times the toasters. And then last but not least, how much bread or how many slices can one person process per hour? Well, it's going to be 60 slices per hour. So we'll do 60 times, let's call them workers. I was going to call them toasters, but we are already using that for the equipment, times the number of workers. And so it's worth, at this point, just pause this video and really process what's going on. What are the inputs here and what are the outputs? Well, the inputs are right over here. The number of slices of bread per hour, the number of toasters we have at our disposal, the number of workers. Toasters you could view as capital, workers you could view as labor. And now another interesting thing to think about, and we will talk a lot about this in economics, is what's going on in the long run and the short run. And production functions are useful for thinking about the long run and the short run because the short run is defined. The short run is defined as the situation in which at least one of your inputs is fixed. Let me write this down. At least one input is fixed. Now, what does that mean in our bread toasting example right over here? Well, let's just say that it's very easy to get slices of bread. If we have the capacity and we want to produce more bread, the slices of bread are, let's say it's just never our rate limiting factor. So that part isn't fixed. But to get a new toaster, let's say these are special toasters, and you got to order them and it takes a month. So let's say that there's a 1 month lead time on this input. 1 month lead time. And let's say for workers, there's just not a line of people ready to toast. You have to put a job posting out there and you're going to have to interview people. And so let's say that it takes 2 weeks to hire someone. So 2 weeks to hire. Or I guess you could also say 2 weeks to hire or to fire someone if you want to reduce capacity. And let's say it takes 1 month to either get a toaster or to remove a toaster. Well, in that case, the short run in this situation is a time period where at least one of the inputs is fixed. So pause this video and think about what would be the short run in our situation. Well, the short run in our situation, the number of toasters we're going to have is going to be fixed for at least a month. So our short run in this situation is up to a month. So up to a month. And then the other side of it, what would the long run be? Well, in the long run, by definition, none of your inputs are fixed. You can change the number you have of any of these things. So our long run is going to be greater than 1 month in this example. Now, it's really worth noting that was just for this example. If we were talking about some type of automobile factory and the output is the number of automobiles produced per day or per month, and then you have all these inputs, you would have your metal, you would have your labor, and then you would have the equipment for the factory itself. Well, there, the long run, it might take another year or even 2 years or 5 years to build a factory. In that case, the long run would be the time period greater than amount it takes to build another factory. Usually capital is the thing that is most fixed for the longest period of time, and that's why I made it hard for us to get our toasters. So I will leave you there. This is just an introduction to the idea of a production function, but hopefully with our bread toasting example, it is not so intimidating. In previous videos, we introduced the idea of a production function that takes in a bunch of inputs. Let's call this input 1, input 2, input 3, and that based on how much of these various inputs you have, your production function can give you your output. In this video, we're going to constrain all of the inputs but one to really take it down to how does our output vary as a function of one input. And as we do that, we're going to be able to understand these ideas of total product, marginal product, and average product. So to give you a tangible example, let's say that we are running an ice cream factory, and we care about how much our ice cream production per day varies as a function of the number of people working in the factory. So let me write this down. So per day, ice cream production. And so let me make a table here. So in our first column, I am going to put our labor, which is, you could view as the input that we're going to see. How does that drive output? So I will put labor. So you could view this as workers per day. Workers. And we're going to see how our output varies whether we have 0 workers, 1 worker per day, 2 workers per day, or 3 workers per day. Now our next column would just be our output, and we'll say that's our total product as a function of labor, TP standing for total product. And let's say that we know if we have 0 people working in our ice cream factory, well then we're going to produce 0 gallons of ice cream. And let's just assume that our output is in gallons, and it's gallons per day. If we have 1 worker at our factory, well then we're going to be able to produce 10 gallons a day. If we have 2 workers at our factory, we're going to produce 18 gallons a day. And if we have 3 workers at our factory, let's say we can produce 24 gallons a day. Fair enough. Now I'm going to introduce an idea, and you have seen this word marginal perhaps at other times in your life. I'm going to introduce marginal product of labor. And the way to think about marginal, that's how much for every increment of one thing, how much more of the other thing do you get? So here, our marginal product of labor says for each incremental unit of labor, for each incremental person working there per day, how many more gallons of ice cream am I producing? So my marginal product of labor, when I go from 0 to 1 workers, I'm able to produce 10 more gallons from that first worker. Now what about when I go from 1 worker to 2 workers? Well then I go from 10 to 18 gallons, so that second person gets me an incremental 8 gallons per day. And then as I go from 2 people working there to 3 people working there, well, my total product goes up by 6. So my marginal product of labor for that third worker is going to be 6. Now, there's something interesting that you're immediately seeing here, and this is actually pretty typical, is that your marginal product of labor will oftentimes go down the more and more people that you add. And you might say, why is that the case? Well, they're just not going to be quite as productive. That second person might be waiting while the first person is using the mixer, and that third person is going to be waiting while the first person and the second person, maybe they're using the restroom or something, and the third person has to go. And you can imagine you had 4, 5, 6. At some point, you're not even going to be able to fit people into the factory. And so you're going to have what's known as a diminishing marginal return. And you see that right over here. As you're adding more and more labor, your marginal return is getting smaller and smaller. So this is a diminishing marginal return. Now the last concept I'm going to introduce you to in this video is that of average product. And this is average product as a function of labor. So AP for average product. And all that is our total product divided by our labor. So over here, when we have 1 worker, our total product is 10 gallons, and we're going to divide that by 1 worker. So our average product per worker is going to be 10 gallons. Now when we have 2 people working per day and we're producing 18 gallons per day, our average product as a function of labor is going to be 18 divided by 2, which is going to be 9 gallons per worker per day on average. And then in this last situation, it's going to be 24 divided by 3, which is 8 gallons per worker per day on average. And you can see this visually as well. I could draw this on a curve. Let me do that. So if on our horizontal axis, I have our labor units, which is workers per day. So 1, 2, and 3. So this is labor right over here. And our vertical axis, I'll have our total output. So total product, I could say. So let's say that's 10, 20, let's say that is 30 right over there. Well, this first one right over here, when we have 1 person working in the factory, we produce 10 gallons per day. And this is total product right over here. When we have 2 people working in our factory, we produce 18 gallons a day. So it's going to be just like that. And notice, the slope has gone down a little bit. We have a certain slope here, but it's a little less steep there. And that steepness of that line or of that curve, that tells you about the marginal product. So it's a little bit less steep, so our marginal product of labor has gone down a little bit. We're having diminishing marginal returns. And then last but not least, when we have 3 people working, we're able to produce 24. So 3 and 24 might be right over there. And once again, we can see our diminishing returns. It gets even a little bit flatter. When we go from 0 to 1, we added plus 10, and you can see that there in the marginal product of labor. And then as we add one more person, it goes plus 8, and then we add another person, it goes plus 6. So in general, if you see total product as a function of labor, or total output as a function of labor, and the curve is getting less and less and less steep, well, that tells you that your marginal product is going lower and lower, and you're getting diminishing marginal returns.
What I want to do in this video is think about a fairly traditional business. I am going into the orange juice business. Right over here, I've written the gallons of orange juice I am going to produce each week. So all of this is going to be on a per week basis. This is my fixed cost. So I'm assuming it's going to cost me $1,000. And let's say that that's the rent for this super robotic orange juicer that I bought that can really, and through that, for the sake of simplicity, we're assuming that we can put as much orange juice as we want, or at least any of the amounts that I've listed right over here. And it also takes into the cost of maybe some employees who are spending some of their time operating this super orange juice mixer. So I'm assuming all of those are fixed costs, that I can't get out of them or buy them overnight, that I've plunked down the cost for the machine, and I've given these employees, let's say I've given them already a 1-year contract. So these are going to be fixed at least for the next year. Now my variable costs here, these are going to be given the amount of juice I want to produce. This is going to be the cost of the oranges, and I guess we could also say the cost of transporting the oranges. And so we see here, obviously if we produce no oranges, we have no variable costs. If we produce 1,000 oranges, then our cost of the oranges and transporting them is $500. If we produce 2,000, it's $850. And something interesting happened. Our incremental variable cost right over here was only $350. For the first 1,000 oranges, it was $500, and then the next 1,000, it was only $350. And so what's happening here is I probably got some economies. I probably got some negotiating power now with some of these suppliers. I'm like, look, I'm buying a lot more oranges now. Let me negotiate the price down. And also maybe with some of the people who are doing my shipping, my transportation. Look, I'm shipping a lot. Now, why don't you give me a better deal? And we see the deal got even better. The incremental from this to this is only $250. And then it starts getting more expensive again. And what's probably happening is as I start buying more and more oranges from the local distributors, I get a better deal. They view me as a bigger and bigger customer. But once I tap them out, then I have to go further and further away. So maybe it's costing more to transport them, or maybe these other suppliers don't take me as seriously, or I go to slightly more expensive suppliers because I've tapped out all of the cheap ones. And so my incremental variable cost for the next 1,000, and we'll think about that later, keeps going up and up and up. And the total costs obviously are just the sum of my fixed costs and my variable costs. So if I want to produce 9,000 gallons of orange juice, it's going to cost me $4,360. So let's calculate using, I'm just using Excel here. Let's calculate the average fixed cost. So we don't want to divide by 0. So remember, the average cost, the average fixed and the average variable and the average total cost, these are each of those costs divided by the total amount of juice that I'm producing, or you can kind of view them as the cost per gallon. So that we're thinking of the average fixed cost per gallon. So what we're going to do, so I'm writing equal to let Excel know that I'm doing a formula now. This is going to be equal to my fixed costs divided by, so divided by my gallons. And you can see that's G8 divided by F8. And actually, I guess you can't see my G's and F's, but this is the 8th row. So that's that right over there. So that is $1. And then if I want my average variable cost, that's going to be my variable costs divided by my total number of gallons. So that's 50 cents. So that first 1,000 gallons to produce the orange juice, the orange juice or to produce a gallon, it cost me about 50 cents worth of oranges, and that includes the transportation costs. And then the total is just the sum of these two things. Or we could have done it another way. We could have taken this right. We could have said that this is just equal to our total costs divided by the total number of gallons. Either way, you'll get the same thing, and maybe I'll do a video mathematically on why that is, or maybe you should explore that yourself. Now, the marginal cost. This is equal to our change in costs, our change in total cost, divided by our change in gallons of juice. So our change in total cost is going to be 1,500 minus 1,000. That's our change in total costs, divided by our change in gallons, divided by 1,000 minus 0, our change in gallons. And that gives us 50 cents. And now, and this is the fun thing about spreadsheets, one of the many fun things of spreadsheets, is now I can select all of these and fill in all of the things below it, and they will use the same relative calculations. So that I'm going to fill without formatting. And what was neat here, and I already set up this chart ahead of time, is to plot these things right over here. And so we see what's going on. So this is a plot that we looked at in the last video when we thought about software developers. This was our fixed costs. Our variable costs go up as we produce more and more. Our total cost is just the sum of the two. So you just take your variable costs and you add the $1,000 from the fixed costs, and you get this curve right over here. What we've done here is we've plotted all of this stuff. The average fixed cost, or actually the marginal cost, the average variable cost, and the average total cost. I haven't plotted the average fixed cost here, but it's really just the difference between the total and the variable cost. Now, let's think about what's happening. So first, let's look at the average, actually let's look at the marginal cost first, because this is interesting, and this kind of goes in with this narrative of, at first, those first oranges that we bought were expensive. We weren't a major producer, but incrementally, as we produce those next oranges, so as we go from the oranges needed for 1,000 gallons to the oranges needed for 2,000 gallons, all of a sudden our marginal cost went down. We are now a bigger buyer. Those incremental oranges are now cheaper to us. And as we get even more, as we go to 3,000 gallons worth of oranges, those incremental oranges get even cheaper for us. And then we have to go and buy oranges from the outside. So those incremental oranges get more and more and more and more expensive. And that's most clear in this marginal cost curve, and it's somewhat clear in the average variable cost. And in the average variable cost, it gets muffled to a certain degree, because remember, the average variable cost at any one of these points, and we calculated it already several times, the average variable cost at any of these points is equal to your variable cost divided by the gallons of juice. So another way to think about it, referring to the last video, if you're taking any one of these points, your average variable cost is the slope between that point and the origin, while the marginal cost is the slope between that point and the previous point. So the marginal cost is really showing how much are those next incremental oranges costing you, not just how much are all of the oranges on average costing you. So that's why the marginal cost curve captures how much that very next set of 1,000 gallons worth of oranges, how much that is costing you. And obviously your average total costs, at first you have your fixed costs aren't being spread out too much, but then as you get more and more gallons of orange juice produced, your fixed costs get spread out more and more and more, and so you actually have this gap between the green curve and the orange curve, which is really your average fixed cost, that becomes lower and lower and lower. We here at the Khan Academy are working on some type of a software project, and we need to think about what's the optimal number of programmers we should hire. At least think about how much productivity we're getting per programmer when we are working on this software project. And so what I've done over here, this is a spreadsheet, so I'm not going to be able to write. I'll only be able to type. This is Microsoft Excel right over here. In this column, I have the different numbers of programmers. And then let's say based on other studies or industry studies or past experience, this tells us how many lines of programming code we can get per month. And obviously lines of code isn't maybe the best way to measure things, because someone can write good lines or bad lines of code. But let's just say this is one way of measuring productivity for software engineers. So the first thing I'm going to think about is what are my fixed costs? So what am I going to spend no matter how many software engineers I hire for this project? And for the sake of this video, my fixed costs will be the office space and the electricity, and let's assume I just have an office that can accommodate any number of these programmers. So that's a fixed cost. That's not going to change depending on the number of programmers that I have. And then the other fixed costs, let's say I have a product manager for this project, and I'm going to pay her salary to essentially help spec out what this software should actually do. So her salary is, let's say, $10,000 a month, and then another $5,000 a month in office space for everybody. So it's going to come out to $15,000 a month. And that's not going to change regardless of however many programmers I have. So I'm going to go into Excel. I'm going to go to this little bottom right over here, and I'm going to drag that down. And so it's going to be $15,000 in fixed costs no matter how many programmers I end up hiring. Now the variable costs. Let's assume that the full, sometimes people, well, let's just say that the full compensation for a programmer is $10,000 a month. So if you include the cost of their salary, if you include the cost of their health insurance, you include the extra goodies that they will eat from the company kitchen, whatever it might be. So it's going to be $10,000 a month. So my total variable costs are going to be $10,000 times the number of programmers. So here I'm going to write equals, and I'm going to write it's going to be $10,000 per programmer times that little snowflake. I pressed Shift 8 to get that snowflake, times, and I could say times whatever is in that cell. So you see it's cell D7. And actually, let me scroll this over so that you can see, so you can actually see the cells. So that is cell D7, and let me press enter. So that cell, so it's $10,000 times D7, which is this one right over here. And I just selected that, and I can press enter. And right now, that's nothing. Let me scroll over so we can see everything a little bit better. Let me scroll over a little bit to the, there you go. I'm having trouble. Okay, there you go. Now, what are going to be my total costs? My total costs are my fixed costs plus my variable costs. So that's going to be equal to, and I'm just using my arrow keys right now. It's going to be equal to F7, right? That's cell F7 plus this one, plus my variable costs. My total costs are my fixed costs plus my variable costs. And so it's $15,000. And actually, I can make this true for every row over here. And this is one of the really useful things about a spreadsheet, is I defined this cell as being $10,000 times whatever this cell, or times whatever this cell is right over here. And so what I can just do is I can just drag that all the way down. And for every one of these, it's going to take $10,000 times the cell that's essentially 3 to its left. So now this is going to be 10,000 times D8. This will be 10,000 times D9. And let's look at that. So we can see right there, 10,000 times D9. And you could, if you click on there, you can actually see what the formula is, 10,000 times D9. So by dragging that, I was able to get the right formula all the way down. Now the total cost for every row here is going to be 2 to the left plus 1 to the left. And so if I drag that down, it'll do that for every row over here. So now this is 25 is the 15 plus the 10. 105 is 15 plus 90,000. Our total costs are fixed costs plus variable costs. Now let's think about the average fixed costs. And the average fixed costs, we're going to think about it in fixed costs per line of code produced. And over here, line of code produced is 0, so you're going to divide by 0, which is undefined. So we could leave that blank, but we could fill this one in. So our total fixed cost, this is going to be our total fixed costs, which is cell F8. I just use the arrow keys to select F8, divided by our total lines of code per month. So divided by our total lines of code per month. And so that gets me $3.75 fixed costs per line of code. And then I can do the same thing that I've been doing before. I can drag this down, and then we see what the fixed cost is. So at any given point, if I take the fixed cost, $15,000 divided by the lines of code, I get $1.38. And this actually makes sense, because the more programmers I add on to this project, the more lines of code I get, I'm using the same fixed costs. I'm using the same project manager. I'm using the same office space. So the cost of that project manager, that office space, gets spread out along more and more code. So the fixed cost per line of code goes down as we add more and more programmers. Now, what is the average variable cost? So once again, the variable cost is going to be whatever the variable cost is per lines of code per month. So when we're talking about average, we're talking about average cost per line of code. And maybe I should, so this is per line of code, let me write it over here, per line of code. And I can even say per month, per line of code per month. Actually, I wanted that to spread out more, but the way I've set it up, so let me scroll down. Whoops. I'm having issues here. All right. Well, these are all per line, average lines of code per month. And so let's think about what happens with our variable costs. So I'm also going to start here because I don't want to divide by 0. So in this month, our total variable costs were $10,000, and our total lines of code are going to be $4,000, G8 divided by E8. And so average variable cost per line of code is $2.50. And then what happens, so let's do that for every row over here. So when we do it for every row, something interesting happens. Our average fixed cost went down because we're taking the same cost and we're spreading it out amongst more code. But our average variable costs went up. As we added more programmers, per line of code, it actually cost us a little bit more on average per line of code. And that's actually, if you look here, as we add, the incremental lines of code we get per programmer is actually going down. That first programmer by themselves, she can write 4,000 lines of code. But then that second programmer is only, you're not getting to 8,000, you're getting to 3,000. And probably because they have to coordinate with each other, they have to plan a little bit more. It's not all in one person's head. And then when you add the third one, you're not even adding 3,000 lines of code, you're only adding 2,000 lines of code. And this is actually a real phenomenon that actually happens in companies. The more people you add on to a project, obviously they can maybe do more work, but there's also more coordination, there's going to be more meetings, there's going to be more interruptions, and so each person's individual productivity is going to go down. And this isn't to say that this third coder is somehow worse than the first coder. On average, all of them are now only going to produce 3,000 lines of code a month, when maybe individually they could have each produced 4,000 lines of code, but they have to spend some of their energies now coordinating it. And so that's why our average variable costs per line of code is going up. As we add more and more people, it's getting us incrementally, it's becoming more and more expensive on average to write that line of code. And if we look at average total costs, that's going to be, and this is once again, this is per line of code, it's going to be our total costs, H8, divided by the total lines of code per month. So if we just hire one engineer, we're going to have $6.25 spent per line of code, and that's because a lot is spent on. And this is actually just the sum of these two right over here. And then let me make that true. Let me set that formula for every row. And so we see something interesting. When we start to hire a few engineers, we're able to spread out our fixed costs. Even though our average variable costs per line of code are going up, our fixed costs are going down. So we're getting a little bit of a benefit because we're spreading our fixed costs per line of code. But then it starts to get expensive again because, as we said, the more people you have working on the project, they're going to have to spend more time coordinating with each other and maybe even undoing each other's work or redoing each other's work as opposed to just writing the actual software. And now let's think about the marginal cost. The marginal cost, the best way to think about it is, what is the incremental cost of that next set of line of code? So one way to think about it, so this is going to be how much more you're spending divided by how much more code you're getting. So how much more, so for example, how much more, and this is going to be once again per line of code. So once again, so we're spending, when we go from 0 programmers to 1 programmer, we're going from $15,000 of total costs to $25,000 of total costs. So we're going from, we do it in parentheses, 25, if we're going from 15 to 25, that means we're increasing our expenditure by 25 minus 15. And so that's why I'm doing H8 minus H7. So that's how much more we're spending in expenditures. And then how much more code are we getting? Well, we're getting 4,000 minus 0 lines of code. And the reason why I'm doing the formula this way is so that when we drag it down on all the rows, the formula will be right, because it's relatively taking the right cells into account. And the reason why I'm saying it's average is because this is saying what's the incremental cost per line of code for this first 4,000 lines of code. And then we can go from there and we can drag it down. And now this tells us the incremental cost per code for the next 3,000 lines of code. And once again, it got a little bit more expensive because we're getting a little bit less efficient as we add more and more people. And there's something very interesting that happens here, and you might have even noticed it in these numbers over here. We actually get a negative marginal cost. And this isn't meaning that when we add more lines of code, somehow we're getting money. It's actually saying that as we spend more money, we're actually killing lines of code. Because at some point, if you have too many people on this one project team, they actually start killing each other's productivity. And you can even see it right here in the numbers. When we had 7 people, we were able to write 11,400 lines of code. But then the 8th person, because of coordination, it's not that this 8th person is incompetent. It just, when you have 8 people in a team, everyone's productivity goes down so that you're only able to produce 11,200 lines of code. And that's why you had this negative marginal cost. Now when you get to 8 people, all of a sudden, by spending more dollars, errors, you're actually destroying some of what you are actually trying to produce. So what I wanted to do here is just to really get you behind the numbers and really maybe give you a little sense of how you can actually do this with a spreadsheet and get you thinking a little bit about how a firm's cost structure might actually work.
Firm costs. 21. What you will learn. What types of costs does a firm face? How does the firm generate its marginal and average cost curves? Why do the firm's costs differ in the short run and in the long run? From the production function to cost curves. A fixed cost is a cost that does not depend on the quantity of output produced. It is the cost of the fixed input. A variable cost is a cost that depends on the quantity of output produced. It is the cost of the variable input. Learn by doing. Practice question 1. You own a deli. Which of the following is most likely a fixed input at your deli? A. The dining room. B. The bread used to make sandwiches. C. The tomato base used to make soups. D. The employees. A. The dining room, correct answer. Total cost curve. The total cost of producing a given quantity of output is the sum of the fixed cost and the variable cost of producing that quantity of output. TC equals FC plus VC. The total cost curve shows how total cost depends on the quantity of output. 1. The total cost curve becomes steeper as more output is produced, a result of diminishing returns. With diminishing returns, additional units of output require more and more labor, therefore the cost increases. Total cost curve. Figure 21:1. The curve gets steeper as output increases due to diminishing returns to labor. Marginal cost. The marginal cost is the change in total cost generated by one additional unit of output. MC equals the change in TC / the change in Q. Where delta equals change, TC equals total cost, and Q equals quantity of output. 9 Marginal cost example. Table 21:1 Costs at Selena's Gourmet Salsas. Ten marginal cost graphs. 11 Why is the marginal cost curve upward sloping? Because there are diminishing returns to inputs in this example. As output increases, the marginal product of the variable input declines. This implies that more and more of the variable input must be used to produce each additional unit of output as the amount of output already produced rises. And since each unit of the variable input must be paid for, the cost per additional unit of output also rises. Average cost. Average total cost, often referred to simply as average cost, equals total cost per unit of output produced. ATC equals TC/Q. Average fixed cost equals fixed cost per unit of output produced. AFC equals FC/Q. Average variable cost equals variable cost per unit of output produced. AVC equals VC/Q. Learn by doing. Practice question 2. You produce widgets. Currently, you produce 4 widgets at a total cost of $40. Suppose you could produce one more widget, the 5th, at a marginal cost of $5. If you do produce that 5th widget, what will your average total cost be? Has your average total cost increased or decreased? A. Your average total cost has decreased to $11. B. Your average total cost has decreased to $9. C. Your average total cost has increased to $9. D. Your average total cost has increased to $11. B. Your average total cost has decreased to $9. 15 average costs for Selena's gourmet salsas. Table 21, 2 average costs for Selena's gourmet salsas. 16 average total cost curve for Selena's gourmet salsas. 17 average total cost curve. Increasing output has 2 opposing effects on average total cost. The spreading effect: the larger the output, the more output over which fixed cost is spread, leading to lower average fixed cost. The diminishing returns effect: the larger the output, the more variable input required to produce additional units, which leads to higher average variable cost. 18. Putting the 4 cost curves together. Note that 1. Marginal cost slopes upward because of diminishing returns. 2. Average variable cost also slopes upward but is flatter than the marginal cost curve. 3. Average fixed cost slopes downward because of the spreading effect. 4. The marginal cost curve intersects the average total cost curve from below, crossing it at its lowest point. 19. Marginal cost and average cost curves for Selena's gourmet salsas. 20. Learn by doing. Practice question 3. At high levels of output, the spreading effect is A. Stronger than the diminishing returns effect. B. Weaker than the diminishing returns effect. B. Weaker than the diminishing returns effect. Correct answer. Minimum average total cost. The minimum cost output is the quantity of output at which average total cost is lowest, the bottom of the U-shaped average total cost curve. 3 general principles are always true about a firm's marginal cost and average total cost curves. 1. At the minimum cost output, average total cost is equal to marginal cost. 2. At output less than the minimum cost output, marginal cost is less than average total cost and average total cost is falling. 3. At output greater than the minimum cost output, marginal cost is greater than average total cost and average total cost is rising. The relationship between the average total cost and the marginal cost curves. Does the marginal cost curve always slope upward? One of 2. Marginal cost curves often slope downward as the output goes from 0 up to some low level, and they slope upward at higher levels of production. The initial downward slope occurs when employing more workers allows them to specialize in various tasks. This specialization leads to increasing returns to the hiring of additional workers and results in the marginal cost curve sloping downward. Once enough workers exhaust the benefits of specialization, diminishing returns to labor set in and the marginal cost curve slopes upward. Typical marginal cost curves have the swoosh shape. Does the marginal cost curve always slope upward? 2 of 2. October 20th, 23.
We've talked about the idea of average total cost in several videos so far, where it was the sum of your average variable cost and your average fixed cost. But when we're talking about fixed costs, by definition, that means we're talking about things in the short run. Remember, the short run is defined as the amount of time over which at least one of your inputs is fixed. But if we talk about longer term, so let's say you're running a factory, and in the short run would be how long it takes to build another factory, or how long it takes to close down or sell another factory. But in the long run, you can always add more factories or shut down factories. So in the long run, everything is variable. So what we're going to do in this video is think about how the average total costs that we've studied in previous videos, which were actually short-run average total costs, how those relate to the long-run average total cost. So let's imagine that we are trying to open up a food truck business. And let's say that each food truck, and let's say we're going to sell tacos. So these are taco food trucks. And so each food truck can optimally, I'll just write it like that, serve 100 tacos per day. And we haven't started our business yet, but we have to decide how many food trucks to buy. And we do some market research, and we feel pretty confident that we're going to be able to sell 200 tacos per day. So we're going to target 200 tacos per day. Now, in this world, what you would want to do is optimize your fixed costs to minimize your average total costs for 200 tacos per day. Remember, your fixed cost is essentially going to be, let's say it's just your food truck, and then you're going to have variable costs. It might be the staff that's making the tacos. It might be the supplies for the tacos, things like that. And so you might have an average total cost curve that looks like this. So let me make some axes here. So this is going to be quantity of tacos per day. Quantity of tacos. And this is going to be per day. And then in the vertical axis, this is going to be cost per taco. Cost per taco. And let's say, since you're optimizing for 200 tacos today, you want to minimize your cost per taco, 200 tacos per day. That happens with 2 food trucks. So if we're at 200 tacos per day, let me put it right over there, 200 tacos per day, we get to a cost per taco, average total cost per taco. Let's say that is 50 cents. So that is 50 cents right over there. But the actual number of sales, the actual number of tacos that you might have to produce in a given day might vary from that. And that will actually help construct your average total cost curve. And so your average total cost curve might look something like this. It might look something like this. We've seen curves like this in the past. And we would call this our average total cost. But now, because we're differentiating between our short run and long run, let's make this very clear. This is our short run average total cost, and this is a situation where we have 2 of our food trucks per day. 2 food trucks. Now, what if instead of 200 tacos per day, it ends up that we only have to produce 100 tacos per day because that's how many people are demanding? So let's say this is 100 right over here. Well, if we keep the number of trucks we have constant, so we don't change our fixed costs, well then our cost per taco is going to be higher. Let's say that this right over here is, let's say this is 70 cents. 70 cents per taco. And then there's the other scenario. Let's say that our tacos sell better than expected. Let's say that we need to somehow produce 300 tacos per day. Well, if we can't change our fixed costs, which is by definition what the short run is, well then we might be at, say, this point. It looks like it would be about, let's just call that 80 cents. 80 cents per taco as our short run average total cost. Now, in either of these situations, let's say that we have the more pessimistic scenario actually happens, that there's only demand for 100 tacos per day. Well, in that world, the rational thing would be, hey, let's sell one of those trucks. We're only at 50% utilization at 100 tacos per day. Let's sell one of those trucks to lower our average total costs. And so in the long run, you can adjust your fixed costs. So with one truck, we're at a curve that looks like this. So at 100 tacos per day, our costs are 60 cents per taco. And the curve might look something like this. So if things were to get even worse than that, our costs would go up. And if for some reason the market were to actually go back to what we expected or even beyond, then our costs would go even higher. So this cost curve, which is based on one truck, so let me call this our short run average total cost, and this is for one truck. This would be suboptimal if we actually do have 200 units being produced a day or 300 units produced per day, but it is optimal for 100 units per day. Now, things could go the other way. You might start with those two trucks that are optimal for 200 units per day, 200 tacos per day, but you're in the world where people want to buy 300 tacos per day, and 300 tacos with two trucks is not optimal. So in the long run, you order another truck, and maybe it takes a couple of months for it to show up and be outfitted and whatever. But once you get that third truck, now you can optimally serve 300 tacos per day. And so you might be in this situation. So if you get another truck, you could have another short run average total cost curve that looks something like this right over here. So this is our short run average total cost curve. And so this is when we have 3 trucks. And remember, the short run is when at least one of your inputs is fixed. And in this one, for the simplified model, we're assuming that input is the truck, that everything else is a variable expense. Now, when you look at this, it helps us think about a long run average total cost. What would that be? Well, in the long run, we can change the number of trucks we have. And if we can, in the long run, we can change the number of trucks we have, we would always be picking the optimal number of trucks for the quantity we're producing. So in the long run, we would want to be at that point. So if there's only 100 that we need to produce a day, we would only use 1 truck. If there's 200 produced a day, we would use 2 trucks and be at that point. If we need to produce 300, we would have 3 trucks and be on that point. And so your long run average total cost curve would be connecting these dots. And so it would look something like this. And some of you might be thinking, well, but this situation right over here is where you have 1.5 trucks. What's the deal with that? But in the long run, you might be able to get a custom truck size that is 1.5 times as big as your typical truck, or 2.5 times as big as your typical truck. But the big takeaway here is that your long run average total cost curve, you can view as the envelope of all of the minimum points of all of your various short run average total cost curve. Because for any given quantity, you want to optimize your fixed costs, which puts you at the minimum point of one of these short run average total cost curves.
On long run costs and economies of scale. 22. To what you will learn. How do firms choose the optimal level of fixed cost? Why do the firm's costs differ in the long run compared to the short run? What are returns to scale and why do they matter? Short run versus long run costs. All inputs are variable in the long run. This means that in the long run, fixed cost, like factory size, may also vary. The firm will choose its fixed cost in the long run based on the level of output it expects to produce. Choosing the level of fixed cost. There is a trade-off between higher fixed cost and lower variable cost for any given output level, and vice versa. The long-run average total cost curve. The long-run average total cost curve shows the relationship between output and average total cost when fixed cost has been chosen to minimize average total cost for each level of output. We assume the firm has chosen the cheapest plant size for each output level. Short-run and long-run average total cost curves. Short-run and long-run average total cost curves differ because a firm can choose its fixed cost in the long run. If the firm chooses the fixed cost that minimizes short-run ATC at an output of 6 and produces 6, it's at point C. If it produces only 3, it'll move to point B. If the firm expects to produce 3 cases for a long time, it'll reduce its fixed cost and move to point A. If it produces 9, point Y, and expects to continue this for a long time, it'll increase its fixed cost and move to point X. Returns to scale. There are increasing returns to scale, economies of scale, when long-run average total cost declines as output increases. There are decreasing returns to scale, diseconomies of scale, when long-run average total cost increases as output increases. There are constant returns to scale when long-run average total cost is constant as output increases.